Okay, so I wish to welcome everybody to this PRCA Public Sector Roundtable event. I'm chair of the Public Sector Group. My name is Chrysostomou. I'm Senior Account Director at Westco Communications and also Head of Communications at Havering Council, London Borough of Havering. With me I have an august panel of people, and I will ask them to introduce themselves as well. So, Koray, do you want to kick off?
Thanks, Marcus. I'm Koray Camgoz. I'm the Director of Communications and Marketing at the PRCA.
Carrie-Ann?
Hi everyone, I'm Carrie-Ann Wade and I am Director of Communications and Engagement at NELFT. I'm founder of Cat's Pyjamas Communications Limited and I'm Vice Chair of this group working with Marcus.
Almost as many titles as me. Kate.
Hi, I'm Kate Jarman. I'm Director of Corporate Affairs at Milton Keynes University Hospital and co-founder of something called Flex NHS, which is a movement around flexible working in the NHS.
Thank you. And Mary?
Hi, I'm Mary Whenman. I'm the Director of Communications at the British Business Bank. The bank is the UK's economic development bank, and we've been delivering the government's response to small businesses through the Covid-19 loan schemes.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So the way today's session is going to work, we'll be looking at a series of sort of questions around managing teams during COVID. I'm very happy for people, for participants, for people who are listening in to send in your question if you'd like to. I'll try and allow some time at the end as well to answer if there's any questions there as well. And as I say, just to repeat, basically this is all around how we've been coping in our different ways in managing our teams. Now, you know, we have got quite a few people, senior people in this. And this was more about management than it was about leadership. We're all experiencing COVID in our own way, in different ways. Some of us are working from home. Some of us are still having to go into the office. So colleagues here from NHS, for example, a number of them are still in the office. And we've all experienced different challenges faced by COVID. I mean, I know I've got my whole team working from home at the moment, and you know, it's presented a whole new world of managing teams. So it'd be really good to kind of pursue and talk about any lessons we may have learned from this experience. The good news, of course, that we all know that Boris has announced the roadmap for the future, and it is positive news that we've got a plan now laying out what it could look like, and that obviously will affect how we work in the future, and whether we do start going back into office, or actually does it change the way we work as well? Do we carry on, you know, do we remain changed? So we'll be looking at these kind of questions in today's event. So I suppose just let's talk about a bit more detail about actually how has it impacted you, and I'll go around the table. So and I'm doing it in the order of who I can see on my screen. So Koray, do you want to just talk about how it's impacted the PRCA?
Yeah, so I mean, like most organisations, we've had to adapt really abruptly to the changes that have taken place. Like a lot of organisations in our industry, we sadly had to make redundancies, and as a result, we have fewer resources. But if I'm honest, I don't think it's meant that we've delivered less. If anything, we've probably delivered more. So that, while obviously is testament to the quality of the staff that we have, is a concern going forward, because you know there are question marks over how we can, as an industry, how we can really retain the relentless pace that we've been working at for the best part of a year now. So I think it's impacted us in a number of ways, but ultimately I think in the long term there are a lot of positives that we'll take forward from it. Certainly working from home and the flexibility that, or the stigma that was once associated with working from home won't remain in the future. We're a fully virtually remote team at the moment, and in future will be a blended model of virtual and physical working, which I think will be the same for most organisations. But I think more importantly than that, I think both for us at the PRCA and more broadly for the industry, we are now, I think there's just a lot more humility in the industry. We are more emotionally available to ourselves and to our colleagues than we've ever been. And I think that's driven in part by the fact that people have experienced this pandemic and this shift in very different ways. And you referred to that at the start. I mean, we've published some research which showed there was a real split in terms of whether people believed it was a positive thing, working from home. So we had 42% say it was a positive thing for their mental health and 40% saying it wasn't. And you know, your experience of working at home in a flat share on a kitchen table will inevitably vary from if you have a very comfortable home office, you've got no young children, for example. So I think having management and leadership be mindful of those differences will actually help us going forward, and it will help us to become better leaders and more flexible.
Yeah, you made some good points there, and I think the interesting thing is, I mean, public sector, you know, have been talking about working from home more and being more flexible, but I think this is actually, you know, encouraged us to do it more quickly than otherwise planned, because quite often it's always the, you know, the argument who's going to come in, who's not going to come in, and it never happens until something forces you to do it. With regards to staff, I'm wondering whether, you know, I'm quite comfortable being at home. I've got a spare room, and you know, although I've got some looks like wardrobes behind me, but actually I'm quite comfortable. But not everyone's in that situation. I think that's one of the things we're all learning, and maybe some of the, you know, the people who've got the space are okay when they're people that were most resistant for working from home, and now it's probably the other way around. So, Carrie-Ann, can you tell me a bit about your experience?
Yeah, happy to. So I, like Kate, work in the NHS. So my organisation has about 6,500 staff in total, working across about 200 sites across London, Essex and Kent. I think in terms of the organisation and the impact, some of the biggest impacts so far of the pandemic have been the amount of staff that we've had to redeploy into other roles. So we've redeployed about 500 colleagues at different points throughout the pandemic into different kind of clinical roles that they wouldn't normally be in, just to kind of manage our response in terms of services that we provide to the community. And I think that's been really challenging for people. There was absolutely lots of learning from a HR point of view around that redeployment process, and how fair people perceived that process to be, and how transparent perhaps we were about who was being chosen to be redeployed and asked to be redeployed. So I think that has been one of the biggest ongoing kind of challenges for the organisation. Also very early on in the pandemic, we experienced the loss of a staff member to COVID. So that was back in April last year. And I think that had a massive impact on the organisation. And since then, sadly, we have lost 7 staff members throughout the pandemic. And I think each time we've had to communicate that into the organisation, that's had a big impact on people. I guess if there is a positive side to that, it has really focused the organisation's mind on the well-being of staff. So throughout the pandemic, we've set up like a huge well-being offer for all of our staff that we've now been awarded funding for to set up across North East London for all health and social care staff, which is really positive. And I think there's now obviously that conversation to be had about keeping that as part of business as usual. And as we, you know, hopefully move out of the pandemic, you know, over the coming sort of months and years, that we don't just lose all of that wellbeing work. And I think also for us, we've obviously been working in an incident management response kind of scenario since last March. So I think we're now at the point where business as usual priorities and projects are coming back into play, but as an organisation we're still working in a command and control structure, so trying to get that balance for people in terms of priorities and expectations has been a big thing for us over the last sort of 3 to 4 months. From a comms point of view, our team has been an agile team for the last 3 years, so we have worked quite flexibly in terms of working across different bases and working from home. So I don't think that's been anything particularly new for our team. I think going back to Koray's points that came up through the research, though, I do think, particularly as comms people, there are many of us in the team who are quite extroverted and are really struggling with working from home more. You know, we like to be able to get together, share ideas, bounce things off each other. And I think, you know, a number of the team have found that quite a struggle when we haven't been in the office. Risk assessments have been a massive part of who from the team has been able to go into the office when required. I think that's been a really important part of supporting people. But along with that, I think there's been a lot of work around expectation setting. So I think before, when we might have had calls on comms officers' time to go and, you know, take some photos of the chief exec doing something, we've really had to question whether during a pandemic that's something that, you know, is a priority for us. So we've been having to educate quite a lot of other people outside of the comms teams around, you know, what they can do for themselves, and not having to rely on kind of members of the comms team to go in, really. But going forward, I definitely think it will be a blended model from a comms point of view in terms of how we work, and I don't think we'll go back ever really to thinking we all need to be in the office every day, you know, 8 till 6, manning lines and being seen by the chief exec. So I think, yeah, it's had challenges, but hopefully some positives to come from it as well.
Yeah, I mean, having worked in public sector for quite some time, in the old days it used to be your face had to be seen to show that you're actually doing the job, but I think that's now starting to change. And you made a couple of points that we'll pick up in a bit more detail around well-being and actually business as usual versus COVID. Actually, it's an interesting thing to discuss. Kate?
Yeah, so for me, I've worked in the hospital throughout the pandemic, and we had a sort of slightly early start. We ran a repatriation centre last February for British citizens returning from Wuhan. So we had a sort of run into the pandemic that was slightly longer than other places, I guess. I think I manage quite a sort of diverse group of teams in a sort of corporate affairs directorate. So the comms team have largely been on site, and the demand for they're a small team, and the demand for their services has been absolutely huge, and they found it easier to be on site. A lot of my other teams have worked in a blended model, and some obviously been shielding, some have have been unwell themselves and have needed to be at home and working in a different way for different reasons. I think there's so much learning to come out of this in terms of, you know, what we know we can do now, and I think COVID and working through the pandemic has obviously forced people, you know, Koray described it as an abrupt change. It's forced people to work differently, and all those things that we thought were completely impossible to do. Clinicians from a hospital perspective working at home, for example, so, you know, doing virtual clinics, you know, that thought we'd probably do that in a few years' time, and actually we know that that's eminently possible. We've done virtual ward rounds. We've enabled people to work from home in a way that we never thought we could do at scale and pace. But I think it's also really important to recognize that we are working through we're surviving through a pandemic. You know, this is changed working practices and the ways that we work because people have had to. So employers have had to do this. It's not been a choice. They've had to do it, and people have had to do the best that they possibly can. And also people are working at home, you know, juggling childcare, juggling homeschooling, juggling all sorts of other things. Zoom and Teams meetings and all of that stuff has been fantastic in lots of ways, and has made, you know, that the sort of ability to not have to come into the office you know, a real prospect for people. But it's also really intrusive. So I do more in the evenings now probably than I've ever done, because people don't think twice about saying, "We'll just do a quick Teams call," in a way that they say, "Well, would you mind staying until 7 o'clock to do a meeting?" And actually, well, maybe I would, because I've got to get home for my kids. But actually it's made the ability to be intrusive on home life very easy. And I think that's, for me, it's we have to recognize that, and we have to be able to sort of really evaluate what's good about what the good bits about, you know, increasing people's ability to be flexible and to homework particularly, or work in a blended way, and actually what those boundaries are as we leave the pandemic. And that for me is really important. I do a lot of work around flexible working, and I know that you know, we've got almost 2 workforces in the NHS at the moment. You know, those people that have been frontline, you know, not only just frontline is a bit of a misnomer really, but have been working on site in whatever capacity, clinical or in an operational capacity, who've been working full pelt in the hospital for over a year, but people that have been working at home, who've been working incredibly hard at home, very long hours, isolated from their teams, potentially isolated from anybody actually, anyone else, also potentially juggling all sorts of other things too. So we have to find a way of bringing that and sort of almost reforming culture in our organisations, I think, as we leave this period of time, to say actually what does a blended working model look like? How do we create and keep a sense of team? How do we do all those things? How do we get models, as Carrie-Ann described, that suit extroverts as well as introverts? And how do we recognise all the different issues that bringing these blended models into workplaces, all those issues that arise as a result of this type of model? It's complex, and actually as managers it's really complex to manage remote teams, and actually to shift from presenteeism to productivity and measuring output in a different way is absolutely what we should be doing, but we need a framework in which to do that. It's kind of easy to say and quite difficult to do, I think.
No, yeah, absolutely right, and I think we're all learned lessons and continue to learn lessons, and I think you're absolutely right. The story hasn't ended, is it? There was still a lot more work to do, because whatever the new normal looks like, it's never going to be the same, in my opinion, and it'll be interesting to see how that pans out. Mary, would you like to share what it's like for you?
Yes, for us, it was very intense very quickly. So whilst the bank had prepared for an economic collapse if there was a post-Brexit scenario of that nature, we really started to prepare for the pandemic collapse when the Chancellor stood up at budget last year on the 11th of March and announced the Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan Scheme. We would normally spend 6 months launching a scheme like that, and we launched it 12 days later. And unbeknownst to us, that was going to be the first of 4 schemes we would launch, plus 2 variants, plus other products that we've since launched as well. So for us, it was at that point really going into the unknown. I think we went very quickly from all being in the office. The day we left the office, the following day was our work from home test day, when all the bank systems were tested. We survived, and the systems haven't let us down a single minute, which has just been fantastic. So the way we responded was very quickly set everybody up at home with all the right equipment, and people were offered second screens, laptop risers, keyboards, mice, etc., and everything was delivered to people's homes so that they could get their home set up organised really quickly. I think we also had to, like Carrie-Ann, we had to deploy people internally from existing roles into new roles. We have a UK network team who are based on the road out in regions representing the bank. That role became not needed because we could have no face-to-face contact with people, and we put them into our accreditation team because we had to increase the number of lenders the bank was working to from 40 to over 100, and each of those lenders had to go through an extensive due diligence process before they could start handling taxpayers' money. So they were redeployed there. The bank's a small organisation, and we were about 300 to 350 people at the start of the pandemic. And so we did have to appoint external consultants to support us in certain areas, which has been reported in the media, and it's public knowledge. But it would not have been possible to scale up and deliver the schemes that we had to deliver on behalf of our shareholder base and behalf of Treasury had we not been able to bring external consultants in. So that was an important part of our response as well. I think for my particular team, the challenges we faced were we went from a relatively little known organisation in terms of the man in the street. We were known to the business pages of the national media, but we went into intense public and media scrutiny very, very quickly. Just to give you an example, I was approached from my chief executive to be on the Today programme 7 times. I declined them 5, and we did 2 appearances. Up until that point, I considered that my career pinnacle, getting my chief exec on the Today programme, and there I was declining them. So that was very intense, being under that relentless media scrutiny. And I've done a lot of crisis management in my career, and normally a crisis cycle, as most people know, it's very intense for 2 weeks, possibly 4 if you're really unlucky, and then it dies down. And this just never stopped. It went on for months and months, as I'm sure many public sector colleagues are aware of. And it's having that resilience to get through, and to help your team have the resilience to get through. I think the other things that were also challenging to handle was the increase in social media activity. A really phenomenal stat is at the start of the pandemic, we were getting about 200 mentions on social media for the bank, and the monthly average went up to 500,000 for the bank and the scheme. So we had one social media manager. So looking into the notifications was really challenging, and we fortunately had an external agency, and we had to rely very heavily on our agencies, and they were able to do all the social listening for us, so that we could identify any issues, because that was the only way to keep on top of it with such a sudden spike in interest around the bank. I think picking up on the whole topic of well-being, I think the real challenge has been the breadth of age groups within the organisation, and being cognizant of the different challenges that each age group will face, from people who are potentially at entry level in the organisation, and as Koray said earlier, working in their bedroom in a flat share where maybe all their flatmates are on furlough, and they're having to work 24/7 in a crisis scenario, through to people who've got very young children for whom they have no childcare, through to people who are approaching retirement and quite comfortable in a detached house, and you've got everything in between. So the challenges that each person faces is very different, and it's ensuring that you can support people through those. I've got quite a lot of people who are single in my team, live on their own in their own apartments, and so for them, they've had a very different experience over the last year versus people who may be living in a family environment. So I think that's been really important in terms of people's mental health and well-being.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I know that the PRCA have research industry, haven't you, on mental. I wonder if you want to just share with us what the research came up with, Koray?
Yeah, sure. And fascinating to hear about Mary's experiences. And I think it's always interesting for us to hear those real life experiences of what people have gone through, because it does bring to light the really unprecedented circumstances that we as PR professionals have been through. So I think long before this, it was broadly recognized that our industry, our public relations practice, was amongst the most stressful professions to work in. I think, we have a situation where we're always working to tight deadlines. There's an always on culture, which is compounded by social media and the news cycle. And the immediacy of all that makes for a very stressful environment. And I think if you throw in a global pandemic in the midst of that, and one in which, as Mary's just alluded to, PR and communications professionals are really working themselves to the bone to protect the reputation of their clients and their organizations, then I think the result is a really devastating impact on the well-being of the workforce. And I think, as we've seen, there's absolutely no doubt about the value that we've delivered. And indeed, I think the respect that we now hold and that leadership holds for public relations has increased. But I think we're still at the very early stages of coming to terms with the emotional cost of what we've been through. So that was the pretext for the research that we wanted to undertake. And we did that with Opinium last year. So I suppose it was split into two sections, really. So we surveyed more than 400 PR professionals in total. And the bad news, as you would expect, is the pandemic's had a pretty terrible impact on people's well-being. So more than a quarter of PR professionals, 26%, rated their job as extremely stressful. So that means they were rating it as either 9 or 10 on a sliding scale of 1 to 10 when asked how stressful their job was. So that compares, that 26% compares to just 18% of the broader population. So again, it shows that we're already in a more stressful situation than the broader population. But one thing that did strike me from last year's research was the fact that there has been a real shift in the way people are able and feel comfortable talking about their mental health in the workplace. And that just simply wasn't the case in the recent past. So we ran the same study in 2019, and that revealed that 40% of people who took time off due to mental health were honest with their employers about the reasons for doing so. And last year, that figure jumped to 72%. So what that shows is that we've made quite considerable progress in confronting the taboo around mental health. And I think that's a good thing, because as I mentioned earlier, the pandemic has brought more humility to the industry. People are more emotionally available. And I think that's ultimately a good thing. It's a good thing for our PR practice, but ultimately it's a good thing for our industry and for our team. So that was a kind of a broad overview of the research that we undertook.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think, I mean, talking about individuals and different people in the team, you know, a lot of this stuff we didn't think about until you suddenly realise you can't see each other face to face. Or I know some of you got blended teams, but I want, you probably don't have all the team in the same place at the same time, do you? And you know, and the kind of the well-being part of it in relation to how you keep working as a team is really important. And I always find, and this is my opinion, that, you know, as a boss, a leader, whatever, you know, you've always got more than one role to play, haven't you? You've got, you know, not only is your role about managing the team and make sure everyone knows what the, you know, what the work is like, you know, what the work planning and acting as that link between the rest of leadership, etc. But you're also a counsellor, you know, sometimes you're a friend, sometimes, you know, you're a work colleague, and it's about, you know, how do we, you haven't got the face-to-face empathy aspect of it anymore. You're trying to do this through, you know, through voice calls or whatever. Interesting thing for us is that, you know, managing all my team are remote. So, you know, the way we tend to work is, you know, we have a meeting every morning so we can set what the day looks like. And we used to do it on Skype. I never had the camera on. But actually now we started doing it on Zoom. We can use Teams as well. And a lot of us have the camera on. And actually, you know, from a mental well-being point of view, some people are like, actually, you know, I felt isolated. I haven't seen anyone's face. You know, now I'm seeing everyone's face in the morning, and I'm actually making an effort now. You know, I'm doing my hair now, and you know, whatever. It's kind of even that small thing made a difference. And I think the other thing we've all experienced, and Mary, you've mentioned it in Koray, is that you know, we are under pressure quite a lot as comms teams, but actually, you know, the pressure went up massively, because not only did we suddenly have everyone at home on social media talking to us, and everything we put out, everyone responding to, but of course we was dealing with the quickly changing circumstances of the environment. Mary was talking about, you know, how things have changed for you, and you know, for NHS or local government, you know, constant changes in policy, you know, lockdowns, you know, so, and it was our role to communicate all that, or still is, to communicate to public. So that puts a toll on people as well. And I remember the first time I went into lockdown, people were on it all the time. They couldn't switch off. It was always on WhatsApp, always on email. And I think one of the lessons we've learned is managing that a bit more. I think it's a new normal, I suppose, isn't it? So I'm just interested, has anyone learned any techniques or done something different that, you know, to help the team? Have you been doing something to try and keep in contact? Carrie-Ann?
So we moved from having a formal monthly team meeting to one every week, which we decided we wanted to keep, pandemic or no pandemic. We have a wellbeing kind of standing item on that every week, and I think the first kind of few weeks we did those meetings and we got to the wellbeing section, people were maybe a bit kind of nervous about, or what do we share here? But actually now it's probably the part of the agenda where we have the most conversation, and that's not always work related. So it is the stuff around, oh my god, my kids are driving me crazy, you know, I haven't done any of the things I wanted to do today because the homeschooling's gone wrong. You know, somebody lives on their own, has not seen anyone, how they're struggling with that. And I do think weirdly, as a team, we have become closer and started to share more personal things with each other than perhaps we would have done even face to face, because I think we've purposefully carved out time to say this isn't about talking about deadlines or what project we're working on. This is for us to talk about ourselves and how we're coping. And I think maybe we hadn't been as overt about doing that before when we were having our meetings. We've also put something in place kind of to empower the wider team, where rather than myself and my leadership team leading every meeting, we actually have rotational chairs, and it started out as a buddy system. So even our like comms team assistant, the officers, whatever level you're at in the team, you have an opportunity to chair the weekly team meeting, set the agenda, decide what you would like the team to talk about. And we've now moved to the place where actually, because everyone is a bit more confident in doing that, they're like, we don't need buddies anymore, like we want to do it by ourselves and run the meeting. And I think that's been a really nice thing to do, to kind of empower people and give people an opportunity, weirdly, for a bit of development and to push themselves outside of their comfort zone in kind of a safe space. So I think the way we've come together as a team, even though we've mostly had to do that virtually, has felt like it's kind of been better than ever, really. We had a spell where everybody loved the team quiz as well, so had lots of social stuff where, again, because we're quite dispersed in terms of where we all live and the patch that we cover is so huge, we actually never really used to do too much socializing outside of work, because it was so difficult to, you know, find the right place to go where everyone could get to. And actually being able to do it virtually has meant, you know, we've had the quiz night and the Christmas do and all that kind of stuff. And I think, you know, although we are getting a bit fatigued with all of the online meetings, I do think it has enabled us as a team to come together in a way perhaps we couldn't before.
Yeah, it's an interesting byproduct of this. Kate, you do, I'm just thinking about the kind of managing the homework life balance. And of course, many people now are having to do things like homeschooling and all the other stuff. And I was saying before the call came on about, you know, it's no surprise now being on calls like this, or, you know, meetings, when you see cats and dogs and children, partners or whatever wandering around in the background or contributing to the meeting. I quite like that, actually, it's quite funny. But of course it also puts a strain on the workforce as well. I just wonder what you can, you know, your experiences or the work that you do.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. There is, I think there's, so in some ways it's normalized, and it's sort of normalized home working and home and family life. And it's, you know, we talk a lot in different forums, I guess, about, you know, you bringing your whole self to work, and about recognizing that people at work, you know, you don't leave all of your home life and your other identity at the door when you come into the office. You know, you're still that person in the same way that you're still the person you are at work when you go home. I think there's and this is sort of really, I suppose, really brought that to life, in that people see into each other's lives in a very different way than they would have done pre-pandemic. And for some people, they're quite comfortable with that, I think, and it's, people are, you know, quite relaxed about sort of rolling with it. And for other people, it feels quite intrusive. And I think there probably is a bit of recognizing the differences in people's styles and how comfortable they find that. And that what you were saying about camera on, camera off thing, about actually you're letting someone into your house, aren't you? You know, that's what you're doing when you switch your camera on. And actually that, for lots of people, that's quite uncomfortable, I think. I think there's we've done quite a few things to try and sort of bring people to enable people to sort of feel connected, I suppose, that are home working. So organisationally, we do a weekly Q&A with the exec team that's open to the whole organisation. And I think one thing it's been interesting to reflect on as a communicator is that it's really personalized and informalized communication in the organization, I think. So there's a lot of much more personal communication that's going on. But, you know, as Carrie-Ann sort of described, those team meetings where you talk about well-being, where you talk about people's health and how they're feeling in a very different way, I think, than even you know, just a year ago, that we probably wouldn't have done. The Q&As that I've just come off a Q&A that for the organisation, and, you know, conversation has roamed all around all sorts of different things, from, you know, people's pets through to you know, security at work. And it would never have done that a year ago. We wouldn't have had that kind of organisational conversation. So I think it's interesting to reflect on that and what it means for the future of communicating. I think for me also, in the sort of flexible working world, I'm part of lots of groups that are looking at the sort of future of flex and about helping people to be sort of what the future of flexibility looks like. But I think for me, it's really, really important that we recognise that working at home, and particularly the homeschooling of children, you know, you can't do all those things. There just simply isn't enough hours in the day. You can't teach your kids for 6 hours a day. You can't do 8 hours of work. You can't look after toddlers and babies as well and do all of that in a 24-hour period. It's just impossible. So there's something for me also about recognizing that, and I've been really explicit in this organization and through our flex networks that it's not possible. And actually we don't want people feeling that they are, you know, a terrible parent and a terrible employee because they can't do all of that. It's just an unreasonable expectation. So we have to be clear with people that actually some of what we're seeing at the moment, until schools, you know, are sort of open in a way that we would not sort of more normally recognize, is simply about doing the best you can and about being explicit about that and giving people permission to do that. I hear from people who have, you know, not necessarily in my own organization, although I'm sure that happens as well, but who are, you know, I'm looking after my kids all day and then I'm working till 2 in the morning and then I try and get a couple of hours of sleep and then I get up again and do that 5 a.m. till 7 a.m. and sort of, you know, and we shouldn't expect people to work like that. Or, you know, for clinical staff, I'm working a night shift so I can look after my kids in the day, and we have to not normalize that behavior. We have to be really clear about that actually our staff well-being, you know, matters as just as much now, and we are willing to be flexible. This is what will hopefully be a short period of time. And I always say in the NHS, you know, we want to get people mostly as they leave university or they leave their training, and we want to keep them until they retire. So actually, you know, across 5 decades, we can afford to be flexible with our workforce to help them and support them through changes in their own lives, because they give time, you know, in bucket loads back to organisations.
And that's the thing, isn't it? As organisations, we're having to think about what our culture looks like in the future, and you know where it was a year ago and what we were used to, and now is a completely different change. And you know, for us as an organisation, you know, like many other organisations, we're looking at, you know, do we need quite so much office space anymore? You know, and you know, we were trying to get to that point, and it's encouraged us to get there. The other thing that I find interesting is, well, it's not interesting, I think, and it's been touched on a few times in the conversation, is do we feel that people have taken understand a bit more what comms can do for their organisations? Because I think comms has had a massive role to play, and you know, from a local authority point of view, you know, we get an awful lot of pressure to communicate government changes and announcements, and you know, and we're very much involved in a lot of the day-to-day, you know, stuff that's happening out there. And of course, for us as a comms team, you know, we've had to get much better at doing the stuff that we really have to do, and managing whatever BAU is like, you know. And I know, Carrie-Ann, you were saying that more BAU starting to come in, but do you feel that, I mean, I've always felt there's an enormous amount of respect for comms, but do you think that's changed for the better now? Mary, I don't know whether you said about how much time and, you know, the small team have had to put into this.
Yes, I think that's absolutely the case, and that has happened. I think whilst the bank's communications team was well regarded at the start of the pandemic, I think we were probably perceived as the good news team, because the bank hadn't really, it's only 8 years old, hadn't really gone through any significant crises or issues. And so what we've been able to do as a result of the pandemic is demonstrate what we're really capable of as a corporate communications team, and that we are the first line of defence in terms of managing the reputation of the bank. And that's meant working really closely with the chief executive, Exco, the chief risk officer, and our board to ensure that the reputation is managed correctly. So I think that has absolutely put communications at the centre of the organisation as a strategic management tool, whereas it wasn't previously viewed in that way. And the single small change that I made and introduced was that the day we launched the coronavirus business interruption loan scheme, the following day, as you would expect, you want to circulate the media coverage, which we did. And then the day after that, you start to get all the negative commentary coming through. And I thought, actually, I need to share this with my executive committee and they need to see this. And that then led to them having a daily top lines of how the story was changing, what were the new themes coming through, who were the new stakeholders commenting on the different things that the bank was doing. And that was extremely useful and enabled them to focus, and also identified where there might be operational issues within the organisation that were impacting upon our reputation and needed to be dealt with. So my one tip to people is write that, and I took the decision to write it myself rather than outsource it to an agency or to a junior colleague. And it was just the very top line management piece that went out every day, and most days it went to our board as well. We still do that, but fortunately we don't have to do it every day anymore. We just do it on an as needs basis. Then in terms of well-being and what we've done, as a team, we've always had a weekly meeting, so that was absolutely fine, and that's continued. During, I would say, the first sort of 4 months of the pandemic last year, so sort of from March through to July, we had daily stand-ups for the different schemes. And so I would have 4 daily stand-ups from 8 till 10, and then 2 at the end of the day as well. And it was, so you were starting at 8 and finishing at 7. And it was really intense. And you got to the point, I think, by July that you were really resenting having to go to these multiple daily stand-ups. Fortunately, they have all gone away now, and we don't need to do those. We've gone back to just having the weekly team meetings. But what I've also noticed is that you need to spend a lot more time having informal conversations with people. So I have fortnightly one-to-ones with all my direct reports. And I think pre-pandemic, those one-to-ones would have been quite project focused. You know, where are you on this project? Where are you on that project? Now, I would say the majority of those conversations are very informal. How are you? What's going on in your life? You know, talk to me about this and that. It's less of a work-based conversation. That's not to say that if they want to update on a project within that meeting, they can, but those meetings are far less formal because there are so many other meetings that we're all attending that are project-based, that you've got to build that sort of personal time in. Yeah. Then as an organisation, something that we put in place in the autumn is Wellbeing Wednesday. And every Wednesday between 1 and 2, so I'm in the middle of my wellbeing hour at the moment. That's not a problem. You have wellbeing hour, which is in addition to your lunch break. So essentially, it means you can take 2 hours out of your day on a Wednesday. And people are encouraged to go and do exercise. If you want to go and do, you know, take an online yoga class or go out walking. And the internal communications team sit within my team, and they've set up a channel on Teams where people can post photos of what they've been doing during their wellbeing hour. It might be someone's done some baking. We get a lot of pictures of the beautiful Yorkshire countryside because we've got an office in Sheffield. But that's gone down really well with people and has been really welcomed. And then we've had a lot of wellbeing seminars as well, where outside specialists have come in and they've talked about managing stress. We've got one coming up on breathing and using breathing to manage your stress levels and that sort of thing. And so those have also gone down really well. And then the final thing we do that's just a bit of fun and about accessibility to people is every month we have a tea with a senior member of our leadership team where they come and just have a personal chat and you dial in. So you could have 200 people dialing in with a member of the leadership team, but they are to talk about a non-work-based topic, and so that for people to get to know them more. And that's also worked well in terms of making people more accessible. And we've done the sort of regular pub quizzes and that sort of thing as well, like most people have.
Yeah, we've only got, funny enough, we've only got 12 minutes left. My God, it's gone really quickly. So there was lots of things I'd like to talk about, but we are running out of time. But I just wondered, I mean, just going, I love the idea of the wellbeing now. I think that's brilliant. And one of the things we used to do pre-COVID is lunchtime learning in my team. So we used to have a session, and then we started opening it up to the whole council. So you know, we're looking to bring that back in as just to encourage people to break off from work, because that's the thing, is that sometimes people feel they need that excuse to do it. I mean, you know, for me personally, I always make sure I go for a walk in the morning, I'll do exercise, and you know, I'll make sure I break my day up, but not everyone can do that. But as we haven't got an awful lot of time left, at the very beginning I was talking about, obviously we've got the roadmap, and potentially, depending on how things pan out, how many people receive the vaccine, how, you know, infection rates run, etc. You know, potentially we may even be going on holiday in the summer. You know, we've got some positivity to look forward to. We may start having face-to-face meetings. You know, so I just wondered, what do you see the future holding for you? And Koray, maybe you want to mention just from the industry or from PRCA point of view.
Yeah, sure. So I think I mentioned at the beginning that around half of our members had sadly been forced into a position where they had to make redundancies. But the positive is now that around half of them are recruiting. So we're quite confident that this year we'll see a strong bounce for public relations. We know that, you know, the discussion that just took place just now about the value of PR and business leaders really coming to appreciate what we can deliver. I think that that's going to stand us in good stead. In fact, on that point, we had our virtual summit earlier last year, and we had Martin Sorrell talking about the various creative disciplines and how each of them had fared throughout the pandemic. And he singled out public relations and communications as really outperforming all other creative disciplines. And I think that ability to connect an audience with a business now has never really been more important than it is now. So I think we're in a great position. I think the future is bright. I know the Advertising Association last month published a piece of research forecasting double-digit growth for the media industry. So I do see it as a positive year. I do think also, though, that even as we get back to physical working offices, I think there will still be, or there's still a need for the industry to come to terms with the relentless pace that we've all got used to working with. Because personally, I believe it's not really sustainable. And I think some of the other panelists have referred to the fact that, you know, we've kind of worked at all hours of the day with fewer resources, dealing with crisis situations. Mary mentioned that, you know, a crisis that would usually take 2 or 4 weeks to come to an end, it just seems to rumble on. So it's simply not sustainable for us to retain this pace of working. So I think leaders, managers really need to be mindful of that. Even as we go back into working in physical offices, we really do need to implement the policies and the safeguarding techniques to make sure that our people are well when they do return. And I'm hopeful that the blended approach to physical and virtual learning will actually serve us well in the long term. So overall, I'm quite optimistic that this will be a year of return growth. And yes, indeed, hopefully it'll be great to go on holiday as well, because I think we could all do with it.
Totally right. Yeah, I mean, I think there's, funny enough, there's a question about do you think work increases? Do you think it's worth increasing frequency of check-ins? Well, I mean, I think all of us seem to have different. I mean, I have a daily team meeting, and then we have one-to-ones, etc. So, I mean, it's something that, I mean, put your hand up if you think it's worth increasing, or do you think is it about right, or do you want to do more? Just very quickly from you guys on the. Yeah, go on, Mary.
Yeah, I think our sort of team contact at the moment is about right. I think yeah, I think because I think we've returning more to BAU. So even though we're still delivering the government's response and there'll be more to come, we weren't let off our BAU. We suspended our BAU for 3 months, but we still had to deliver it and deliver all our organisational objectives and KPIs. So we've still had to do that. So we're having to do both.
And do you think it looks positive for the future for you?
Yes, I mean, we're obviously going to be at the heart of the economic recovery, so absolutely. But as far as I'm able to comment with the budget taking place next week.
Absolutely, yeah. Whereas a local government would like to benefit from that. That's just me politicking for a moment. Carrie-Ann, what about you?
I would say just on the question about check-ins, I think we increased the amount of check-ins we have both with individuals and as a whole team and as a leadership team sort of quite early on in the pandemic. We actually did a debrief session probably November time as part of debriefing around command and control. So we did instant management team debrief, but we also did a comms team debrief. So we have agreed as a team which things that we've implemented due to the pandemic that we would like to keep within the team, and that is the regular weekly team meeting, the management team calls that we now have that we didn't have in place before. And I think it is really important that the whole team gets to say what's important to them to keep, that we don't just assume as managers what we think is the right thing for everybody. In terms of kind of hopefulness for the future, I would definitely agree within our own organisation, the reputation of the comms team and the respect that we've commanded through the pandemic has been probably better than we've ever had before. I think there definitely is something though around being victims of our own success. So we've worked lots of extra hours. We have never not delivered on anything that's been asked of us. We've juggled the BAU, as Mary's talked about, as well as the demands of the pandemic. But actually, I think because we've delivered, there's that really high expectation of us now that that's going to continue. And it is about the sustainability that Koray's mentioned earlier, setting expectations with the leadership team about what resource you've got, what capacity you've got to deliver things, and what the organisational priorities are, whether they're COVID related or not, I think is going to be really crucial to that. Where I'm optimistic is that we have had some vacancies within our team recently, and we've also secured some funding for some project-based roles. And actually we've seen, sadly through the stuff that Koray's mentioned, with the workforce being, depleted, people having been made redundant, on the plus side of that, we've seen a really high calibre of candidates coming through for those vacancies that perhaps pre-COVID we hadn't seen before, and a real mix of comms professionals from different backgrounds and industries, which I think will really help us to build strong comms teams into the future in the NHS.
That is positive, and that's a whole different conversation, is about workforce and getting the right people.
Maybe
yeah, and I think the work we're doing on COVID has become BAU really. I would say, but there's other BAU work that you used to do that's now coming back again. So it's a BAU with a very big B now, I think. Kate, what about yourself? We've got 3 minutes.
I think very briefly, I think it's I agree with all the points that have just been made really, but I think this has been the time that internal communications has really shone, I think, and actually the importance of internal communications, which I think historically has always been a bit of a sort of poor relation in the communications portfolio. Everyone's been very focused on, media management, for example, but actually internal communications and bringing that together with engagement and staff health and well-being, I think is hugely powerful professionally as well, and really brings so much value to the employee offer. So I think we shouldn't doubt our own value as communicators in doing that. I think there's one thing for me is in reflecting back on the last few months is that in internal communications, more isn't always more. So I think it's we've tried a lot of things. We've been fairly agile in our communications, and we've offered a lot. There is probably a period now that we need to sort of just reflect on, and exactly as Carrie-Ann said, what's worked really well, what do people value, and what do we take forward, and both in sort of channel and in style and type of internal communication. And then I think it's, but I'm really fascinated to see how internal communications and that well-being go sort of hand in hand in the future, and what communications professionals bring to that world.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Yes, I know it's become, and it's, I mean, one of the questions I was going to ask about is how do we reach our workforce who are on the front line, but we just haven't got the time. So, but yeah, thank you very much for taking part in this. It's been really interesting. I think we've got lots of similarities in our worlds, but also there's probably some differences as well. I mean, I think one of the other things I was going to talk about was productivity as well, and I think I've got a sense that it seems that productivity has gone up, but back to Carrie-Ann's point about victims of our own success. So for me, the positive thing is that comms has like all the other frontline services has shown its worth in COVID during the pandemic, but at the same time we have to think about what that looks like when we start going back to normal and how we manage that. But I'm hopeful, and thank you for joining me and having this conversation. And I could carry on for another hour, but we've all got other things to do. So Mary, I hope your well-being is maintained having this conversation as well. Jumping into your hour.
Absolutely. I said to my team, if you ever get a clash on your wellbeing hour, just move it to another point in the week that's good for you. So I will be doing that.
Well, I think it's something I think we should nick. Actually, I really like that. So thank you very much. We've come to an end now, and I look forward to seeing you all somewhere else. And stay safe.